Callum Drest found the woman face down in the snow beside his fence line, and for a moment he thought she was dead. It was the kind of January morning that came hard to northern Saskatchewan, the kind where the cold didn't just bite, it settled into your bones like it meant to stay. Callum Drest had been out before first light to check the cattle, same as every morning, same as he had done alone for 3 years now. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. He wasn't expecting anything at all, but there she was. He dropped to one knee beside her, dark hair frozen at the ends, a wool coat 3 sizes too big, torn at the left shoulder. Her hands were balled into fists against the snow, which told him she was still alive, still fighting something, even unconscious. When he touched her shoulder and said, "Ma'am," loud enough to carry over the wind, her whole body jerked like she'd been struck. "Don't." Her voice came out cracked and low. "Don't touch the coat." Callum pulled his hand back. "You're going to freeze out here." I said, "Don't." He looked at her more carefully then. The coat was tied shut with a length of rope, not buttoned, tied deliberately at the waist as if she'd fastened it herself and didn't want it opened by anyone else. The snow beneath her left side had gone dark. Not frost, something else. "You're bleeding," he said. She didn't answer. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, "but I won't leave you out here to die either." Another silence. The wind moved across the open field and found every gap in his clothing. "My name is Callum Drest," he said quietly. "This is my land. My house is 40 yards behind you. I've got a stove that's already burning, and I've got broth on from last night." He paused. "That's all I've got to offer, but it's warm." She turned her head then, just slightly. One eye opened against the snow glare. "If you untie that coat," she said slowly, "you'll wish you hadn't." "I've seen a fair bit of the world," Callum said. "I doubt it." It took both of them working together, her staggering upright and him keeping her from going back down, to make it to the house. She didn't lean on him exactly. She tolerated him walking beside her, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough that she wasn't touching him unless she had to. He noticed that. He didn't remark on it. Inside, he sat her near the wood stove and put the kettle on. She was shaking badly by then, her teeth pressed together to keep them from chattering. Her eyes moved over the cabin quickly. The door, the window, the 2 chairs, the rifle on the wall, in a way that told him she was mapping it, tallying exits. He had seen men do that after the war. He'd done it himself. "The door doesn't lock from outside," he said, without her asking. "I'm the only one with a key." She looked at him then, really looked. Her name, she said, was Winifred Locke. She said it the way a person states a fact they expect to be challenged. Callum's hand stopped on the kettle handle. He knew that name. Everyone in Heron Falls knew that name. It had been in the Battleford newspaper twice in the past month, once when the charges were filed, and once when she'd disappeared before the trial could begin. The headline had called her dangerous. The constable had called her worse. Winifred watched him the way prey watches something it can't outrun. "Go ahead," she said. "Say it." Callum poured the water, set the cup in front of her, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down. "I'm going to say you're half frozen and you're bleeding through that coat," he said. "And I'm going to say my wife died in this house 18 months ago, and I haven't had a reason to keep it clean since, so I apologize for the state of things." Winifred stared at him. "I'm not saying anything else," Callum said, "until you let me look at that wound." The silence stretched between them long enough that the stove popped twice and the kettle stopped steaming. Then Winifred set down the cup, reached for the rope at her waist with stiff fingers, and began to work at the knot. "You won't like it," she said. "You keep telling me that." The coat came open. Callum had prepared himself, or thought he had. But the body has its own way of responding to what the mind hasn't fully processed it, and for one unguarded moment, he went very still. Winifred's left arm ended at the elbow. It had always been that way. Not from injury, just from how she'd come into the world. The sleeve of her dress was pinned up neatly below the joint, the kind of careful tailoring that had taken years to perfect. What hadn't been careful was the gash along her ribs, just below her arm, where something sharp had opened the skin wide and bled steadily into the lining of the coat. She was watching him. She had been watching him the whole time. He looked at the wound. Then he got up and went to the shelf where he kept the medical kit. "Deep," he said, "but clean, I think. Didn't hit anything vital." "I know," she said. "I checked." "How did you check?" "Mirror and a chair and a great deal of patience." Her voice was dry, almost amused. "I've had to improvise before." Callum dampened a cloth and knelt beside her. "Tell me before I touch anything." She looked at him sideways. "Why?" "Because it's your body," he said, as if that were obvious, as if no other answer made sense. Winifred turned her face toward the stove. He couldn't see her expression, but he noticed her shoulders drop slightly, the way a person's do when they stop bracing for something. He cleaned the wound carefully, asked before every movement, and she told him once, quietly, that he didn't have to keep asking. He told her he did. She didn't argue again. Outside, the snow had started falling in earnest. Inside, the stove burned. A small photograph sat on the mantel, a woman with a calm face and a baby on her knee. And Winifred's eyes moved to it the way eyes move to things they can't help looking at. "Your wife?" she asked. "Nora," he said. "And our daughter, Catherine." She was 4 months in that picture. Winifred was quiet. "Where is your daughter now?" "With Nora's sister in Prince Albert," Callum said. "When Nora got sick, I thought it was better. Safer, cleaner house, more people around." He was quiet for a moment. "I told myself she was better off. I still tell myself that." He said it the way a man says something he doesn't entirely believe, hoping repetition will eventually make it true. Winifred was still looking at the photograph. "What was her name?" she asked. "Your wife, Nora Drest. She was 31. He paused. "Pneumonia. It came fast." "I'm sorry," Winifred said. "So am I." They sat with that a while, and the snow came down outside and the fire held. Then, somewhere beyond the yard, a horse moved through the dark. Callum heard it before Winifred did. A distinctive, irregular gait, the kind made by a horse ridden hard and pulled up too fast. He recognized it the way you recognize a bad smell before you know what you're smelling. He was already at the window when the lantern appeared at the tree line. "Winifred," he said quietly. She was already on her feet. "Is there a cellar?" she asked. He pointed to the trap door beneath the kitchen table. She moved fast, faster than he expected from someone who'd been unconscious in a snowfield 20 minutes ago. She was down the ladder with the trap door pulled nearly shut before a fist struck the front of the cabin so hard the cups rattled. "Dressed." The voice was flat, assured, carrying the easy authority of a man who hasn't been told no enough times to fear it. "Open up. It's Constable Whitmore." Callum opened the door. Gordon Whitmore stood on the step with 2 men behind him, and snow on his shoulders. He was a big man, not tall but wide, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled slightly with age and comfort. He wore his uniform with the studied precision of a man who understood what it communicated. "Evening, Callum," he said, stepping inside without being invited. Callum let him. "We're tracking a fugitive," Whitmore said. His eyes moved across the room. The 2 cups on the table, the coat on the chair, the medical kit still open on the shelf. He was thorough. Callum had always known that about him. A woman named Winifred Locke, wanted for the death of 2 men in Heron Falls. "I heard about that," Callum said. "She came through here, haven't seen anyone." He kept his voice the same way he kept his face, flat, giving nothing. Whitmore looked at the 2 cups. "You having company?" "I had coffee this morning and didn't wash up." A pause. Then Whitmore smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes. "You always were stubborn, Callum. Nora used to say that about you." The use of her name was deliberate. Callum felt it like a hand on his collar. He didn't move. "She killed good men," Whitmore said. "Decent men, men with families, so I heard. Men like Nathan Coyle and George Fenn." Whitmore's voice warmed slightly, the way voices do when speaking of allies. "They were pillars of that community. Their families are grieving." Something cold shifted behind Callum's ribs. He knew those names. Nathan Coyle owned the grain storage on the main road. George Fenn ran the land registry. He knew something else about those names, too. Something he had heard last spring from a woman at the church hall who had lowered her voice and then stopped talking entirely when Whitmore walked past. "I'm sure they were fine men," Callum said. Whitmore searched the cabin, the back room, the pantry, under the bed, the barn. He found nothing. At the door, he turned back. "If she turns up," he said, "there's $40 in it for you. And if I find you've been sheltering her, that's obstruction. I'll have no choice." He said it pleasantly. That was the worst part about Gordon Whitmore. He always said things pleasantly. After the sound of horses faded into the distance, Callum stood at the window for a long time before he opened the trap door. Winifred climbed up slowly. Her face was composed, but her one hand, braced on the top rung of the ladder, was shaking. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes," Callum said, "he will." She sat down at the table and looked at her cup. "You should have turned me in. I thought about it." And he sat across from her. "And then he said Nathan Coyle and George Fenn were good men, and he said it the way people say things they're daring you to disagree with." He paused. "So I'd like to hear your side of it." Winifred looked at him for a long moment. Then she set both elbows on the table, one ending where it always ended, the other braced on her forearm, and she began to talk. The two men had not been saints. Coyle ran the grain storage, which meant he held the economic life of every small farmer in the district in his hand. He had used that leverage in ways that didn't appear in any ledger. Women who came to settle their husbands' debts after those husbands died. Young widows, women alone, had found themselves in a different kind of negotiation than the one they'd come for. Fenn was worse in some ways. He worked at the land registry, which meant he could bury a claim or resurface a disputed title at will. He had done both. "I went to Whitmore," Winifred said. "Twice, with names, with dates." Callum said nothing. He was listening the way a man listens when he already suspects the ending, but needs to hear the whole of it. "The first time, he told me I'd misunderstood." Her voice was even. "The second time, he told me that women in my position," he used that phrase, "my position," should be careful about making allegations against men who had standing in the community. He said it could be seen as troublemaking. She looked down at the table. "He said that someone like me, with only one hand, already dependent on the charity of others for certain things, might not want to make enemies of people who had influence over how that charity was extended." The stove burned. "Someone like me," she repeated, quietly to herself. Callum pressed his palm flat against the table. Anger rose in him the way it had in the weeks after Nora died. Not explosive, not loud, but deep and very still. "What happened the night they died?" he asked. Winifred exhaled. "Coyle had been sending messages through his clerk, telling me to come to the storage office after hours. I ignored them." She paused. "The last one wasn't a request. It said he had spoken to my landlord. I was renting a room in town, and that if I wasn't there by 9 o'clock, I'd find my belongings on the street by morning. So you went." "I went, and Fenn was there." I don't know if they had planned it together, or if it was chance. Her jaw tightened. It wasn't chance. She had fought her way to the door. She had found, on the shelf beside it, a bottle of kerosene used for the lamps. She had thrown it. The lamp was lit. She had run. "The fire spread faster than I thought it would," she said. "I didn't know they were still inside. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought they were right behind me." She wasn't crying, but her voice had gone very thin at the edges. "The inquest said it was murder," she said. "Whitmore ran the inquest." Callum sat back in his chair. Outside, the wind had died down. The snow was falling steadily now, soft and indifferent, covering everything. "He needs you convicted," Callum said slowly. "Or dead," Winifred said. "Either closes the story. What does he know that puts him in the same story?" Winifred was quiet for a long time. Then she reached into the inner pocket of the coat with practiced efficiency. 2 fingers, and a movement she had clearly done 1,000 times, and drew out a folded paper, soft at the creases from being handled. I copied this from a letter I found in Coyle's office, she said, while I was waiting for him, before Fen arrived. She unfolded it one-handed on the table, smoothing it with her palm. It's a record of payments to a constable for dismissing 3 separate complaints filed over the past 2 years. She tapped the paper, all 3 women, all from the same district. Callum leaned forward and read it. He read it twice. The initials beside the payments were GW. If that letter reaches the right hands, he said. Whitmore Burns, she said. Yes. She paused. But he knows I have it. Or he thinks I do. That's why the charges weren't filed through the proper magistrate. That's why there's no lawyer appointed. That's why there's $40 reward and 2 men on horseback instead of a formal warrant. She folded the paper back along its creases. He's not pursuing justice. He's trying to recover property. Callum was quiet for a long time after that. He looked around his cabin, the unwashed cups, the photograph on the mantel, the empty chair beside the stove that had been Nora's. The house he had been letting go room by room, month by month, because there hadn't seemed to be any particular reason to keep it up. There's a magistrate in North Battleford, he said finally. Aldous Price. He served with my father on the land board. He's the kind of man who doesn't like being told what to conclude. Winifred looked up. It's 2 days' ride, Callum said. Roads are rough in January. We'd have to leave before first light, and we'd have to go around the east side of the valley to avoid the main road. She said. He met her eyes. You can't ride that distance alone in your condition, and I'm not sending you out there with that document in Whitmore, somewhere between here and the horizon. Why? She said, not challenging, just asking, genuinely wanting to know. Callum thought about it. Because Nora would have wanted someone to have gone with her, he said, when she needed it. He paused. I didn't always understand that when she was alive. I understand it now. Winifred looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and tucked the paper back into the coat. The next morning, Callum came downstairs to find Winifred in the kitchen. She had cleared the table, washed the cups, and, remarkably, rebuilt the fire from the coals using a technique he couldn't quite reconstruct from the evidence. The tongs resting at an angle against the grate, the kindling arranged just so, everything tidy. She glanced at him when he appeared. Don't, she said before he could speak. I was going to say the fire draws better when the dampers opened at that angle. She paused. Oh, a beat. I may have figured that out myself. I noticed. She looked at him steadily. Are you going to tell me I'm inspiring? No, he said. I was going to ask if you wanted porridge. She sat down. Yes, please. There was in the making of that breakfast a small and ordinary piece. They didn't talk much. Callum made the porridge and she told him it needed more salt, and he agreed. The fire burned well as she had built it, and the snow outside the window had the clean, bright look that January mornings sometimes wore in Saskatchewan when the weather had finally said what it needed to say. He noticed that she ate with her right hand, keeping her elbow close to her side, not making a performance of accommodation. At some point, the molasses jar was too far for her to reach without an awkward stretch. Without comment, he moved it closer. She didn't thank him. She just used it. That felt right to both of them. After breakfast, she asked about the horse. He had 2. A big bay called Sergeant who did most of the farm work, and a smaller roan mare named Sunday who was better tempered and hadn't been spooked by much since she was 4. Sunday then, Winifred said. Can she take commands from a single rein? He looked at her. She can if you know how to ask her right. Show me, he showed her. It took 20 minutes in the cold yard, and by the end of it, Winifred could turn Sunday left and right and stop her with pressure from one knee in the rein. She had clearly ridden before. She had clearly made her own accommodations over years of practice. Callum watched and did not offer to help unless asked, and she asked twice, and he answered and stepped back each time. When they were done, she patted Sunday's neck with her palm and looked at him. I'm not easy to travel with, she said. It didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like honesty. "I'm not easy to talk to," he said. "I imagine we'll balance out." They left before dawn. For the first half day, they barely spoke. The road through the East Valley was hard-packed and drifted in places, and Callum broke trail where the snow lay thick across the track, and Winifred followed without complaint. She rode well. He had expected to worry about her more than he found he needed to. They stopped at midday in the shelter of a spruce bluff to rest the horses and eat the bread and salt beef he'd packed. Winifred ate standing, watching the road behind them. He watched the road ahead. Between them, the horses breathed clouds of warm air into the cold. "What did your wife do?" Winifred asked. "Before she got sick." "Schoolteacher," Callum said. "Elementary. She was patient in a way I've never understood in a person. 23 children in one room. And she knew all of them by name, knew which ones were hungry, which ones were frightened of their fathers, which ones needed to be caught doing something right so they'd believe they could keep doing right." Winifred was quiet for a moment. "That's a particular kind of intelligence." "It is," he said. "I told her that once. She laughed and said it was just paying attention." "That's the same thing," Winifred said. He looked at her. She was still watching the back road, her posture straight against the cold. "What did you do?" he asked. "Before Heron Falls dressmaker," she said. "In Saskatchewan. I had a shop, small but mine." A pause. People were surprised. They'd come in thinking they were doing me a kindness by giving me their business, and then they'd see the work and come back because it was good. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. "I liked that part. Why did you leave?" The almost smile faded. "My landlord sold the building. I needed cheaper rent. Someone in Heron Falls said there was a woman who needed alterations done. Would be steady work." She looked out at the spruce trees. There was steady work for a while. Callum thought about the life she was describing, the careful architecture of independence built around a skill, piece by piece, and then the way a single door closing could begin to collapse what took years to build. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be sorry," she said, not harshly. "Just make sure we get to North Battleford." They rode until the light went flat and gray and made camp in a hollow where the spruce cut the wind. Callum built the fire. Winifred set up the bedrolls using a system of her own. Boot on the corner, forearm across the roll, a quick unfurling motion, and had hers done before he'd found the matches. "You fold better than I do," he said. She gave him a long look. "Is that a comment on my bedroll or an apology for something?" "The bedroll." "Then yes," she said. "I do." They ate the last of the bread and sat by the fire in the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable, just inhabited. The cold pressed in at the edges. Above them, the sky was clear now, and full of stars in the way prairie skies go full in winter, extravagantly, as if they're showing off. "Do you think he'll know which way we went?" she asked. "He'll know eventually," Callum said. "Men like Whitmore always do. Then we need to be there before he can get ahead of us." "Yes." She was quiet a moment. "Callum," she said it the way she said most things, plainly, without softening. "If something happens to me before we reach the magistrate, nothing's going to happen to you. If something does," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken, "the letter is in the left inner pocket. The copy I made is folded inside the right. Take both. Don't let him tell you they're forgeries." Callum looked at her across the fire. "He'll say I made them up," she said. "He'll say I'm a troubled woman. He'll say the arm explains the character, the way some people do." Her voice was very level. "Just don't let him be the loudest voice in the room. That's all I'm asking." "Nobody's going to be louder than the truth," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Sometimes they are," she said. "Sometimes they are for a very long time." She pulled her blanket closer. "I'm not afraid to die. I'm afraid to die and have him win anyway." Callum fed a branch to the fire. It caught and threw up a brief brightness between them. "He won't," he said. She looked at him another moment. Then she lay down, face toward the fire, and closed her eyes. Callum sat up for another hour, watching the road. They reached North Battleford on the afternoon of the second day. Callum had met Aldous Price once before. Years ago, at a land board hearing, where Price had listened to me to 3 hours of conflicting testimony, and then asked 4 questions that unraveled the whole of it. He was in his 60s now, a thin man who wore his age like a well-made coat, not without weight, but carrying it properly. He received them in his office without fanfare. Winifred laid the letter on his desk, then the copy, then she told him everything, in the same level voice she had used at Callum's kitchen table, missing no detail and adding no drama, because the facts were dramatic enough without embellishment. Price read both documents. He asked 4 questions, the way Callum remembered. He asked them quietly, looking at Winifred, and when she answered, he did not look at Callum to verify. He listened to her. Afterward, he sat back in his chair and was silent for a long moment. "These initials," he said. "Gordon Whitmore," Winifred said. "Constable in Heron Falls. You copied this under duress the night of the fire." "I copied it while I was waiting," she said. "Before anyone arrived. Before anything happened. I had been waiting in that office for 20 minutes, and the letter was on the desk, and I read it." She paused. "I copied it because I recognized the names of the women who had complained. I knew 2 of them. I had already tried to report what had happened to them. I thought it might matter, someday." She looked directly at Price. "I was right." Price nodded slowly. He called for his clerk. The inquiry took 3 weeks. Callum stayed in North Battleford for the first week and then made the ride back to tend to the cattle and his land, returning when word reached him that things were moving toward a conclusion. Whitmore was brought in on the 8th day. The 2 men behind him at Callum's door turned out, under questioning, to have been promised extra pay from a private account Whitmore maintained, which was itself of interest to the provincial authorities. Callum was there on the day Winifred spoke publicly before the inquiry panel. She wore a dark dress, and her hair was pinned up, and her coat was new. Callum had noticed she'd had something altered at a shop on the main road, paid for with what he suspected was the last of the coins she had left when she arrived in Heron Falls. She stood at the front of the room with no binding to hide herself, no coat held closed with rope, no posture of apology. She told the story straight through. Every woman she named, every date she could remember, every door that had been closed before she reached Whitmore's office, and the 2 that had been closed after. One of the inquiry panel members interrupted once to ask if she could describe the state of her. He paused, her arm for the record. She turned to look at him with an expression of such perfect patience that the man actually glanced down at his papers. "I was born this way," she said. "I don't imagine it's relevant to the documents in front of you." The member said nothing further. When she was finished, a woman in the back of the room stood up. Her name was Irene Malloy, and she had filed one of the 3 complaints that appeared in Coyle's letter. She had never met Winifred Locke, she said. "Thank you for saying it out loud. I have been trying to say it for 2 years. Then another woman stood. Then a third. Callum stood at the back of the room and watched the walls of it change, the way a room's walls change when something that has been held in them too long is finally let out. Whitmore was stripped of his position on a Thursday morning in February. The charges against Winifred Locke were dismissed the same afternoon. Outside the office where the clerk read the decision, Callum stood in the cold with his hat in his hands. Winifred came out behind him. She stood beside him on the step and looked at the street of North Battleford, the horses, the storefronts, the people walking past who had no idea what had just happened inside. And she breathed out slowly, as if she'd been holding that breath for a very long time. "What will you do?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet. I'd like to go somewhere and sleep for about a week first. There's a room at the boarding house on Cedar Street," he said. "Mrs. Turnbull runs it. She's decent. I already asked." Winifred turned to look at him. "When did you ask?" "Yesterday." She looked at him for a moment. "You were that sure?" "I was sure Price would be fair," he said. "I was sure the documents were what you said they were. And I was sure you told the truth exactly the way you told it to me." He paused. "Yes, I was sure." She looked at the street again. The winter light was thin and sideways, the way prairie light is in February, making everything look both small and very clear. "Come back to Heron Falls," he said. "Not right away, when you're ready." He paused. "There's a room in the house. It's been empty too long. And I am not good at being alone in the way I used to think I was." Winifred was still looking at the street, but something had shifted in her posture, not softened exactly. Released. "I had a shop once," she said. "I know, I'd want to work, not sit in a room and be taken care of." "There's a building on the main road in Heron Falls," Callum said. "Empty since the fall. The roof is good. I checked." She turned to look at him then. "You checked the roof," she said, "last week, before we left." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he hadn't seen before. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, and not a careful one, but a real laugh, short and genuine, startled out of her by the sheer specificity of it. He had checked the roof, before they'd even arrived, before he had any reason to be sure of anything. "Callum dressed," she said. "Yes, you are a very odd man. That has been said before." She looked at the street once more. Then she looked at him, and her expression held something that wasn't quite certainty and wasn't quite hope, but was somewhere quietly between them, close enough to live in. "All right," she said. "Show me the building." He put his hat back on. She fell into step beside him, her shoulder nearly at his arm. The winter light, making everything very sharp, and the cold finding every gap as it always would. And it didn't matter, because they were walking in the same direction, and the road was clear, and there was, at long last, somewhere to go.